So today's webinar, we're going to focus on free motion quilting. And I know for me, when I started free motion quilting, it was pretty scary. And I'm sure it is kind of scary for a lot of you. So I want to help to get you in the right mood, the right mode, the right position, all of the right things at your long arm machine. Now, a couple things about free motion quilting. There are some tools that can help you with free motion quilting, and we're going to go over the tools. But the very first thing is you want to make sure your machine is set up correctly for free motion quilting. So let's go over a couple things that we want to make sure that we have correct. One is the take-up rail, the rail that goes in the C of the machine, inside the area of the machine that takes up all of your quilt as you quilt it. That needs to be in a position that will help you to free motion quilt. If that take-up rail is too tight on the bed of the machine, then we have a hard time moving. If it's too high off of the bed of the machine, then sometimes things move too freely. We want to be smooth, but yet we want to have the ability to not be jerky. We need to be fluid when we free motion. So I find if I put my take-up rail on the bed of the machine, but just slightly off of it, so I lower it and then I slightly raise it, I like that movement better than just being free and loose. And then the other thing is you want to make sure that your tension and all of that is checked. You want to make sure that you definitely have tested your threads. You also want to know that your batting is the right batting for how far apart you're going to free motion. And what I mean by that is you need to read the batting package to see how far apart do I need to free motion, or how far apart can I free motion with this batting, and it's still going to stay together and look pretty when I wash my quilt, because the batting is going to determine sometimes what our quilting would be at the end of the day. Because if it's 12 inches apart, we need to know that. We need to know that we can quilt up to 12 inches apart and have no issues with what we're doing. Or we need to know that we have to quilt closer, 4 inches apart, whatever that is. So be sure you know your batting. Now, when we go to the video here in a moment, I'm at my quilting frame and I've loaded a quilt on the frame, and I'm going to show you some things on the video. Right now I'm just going over some tools of the trade. The next tool that you might want to have handy, and I'll show you mine when we go to the video, and that is a sketch pad and some paper and maybe some fine line Sharpie markers, some pencils, things like that. Because in order to get your brain trained, in order to get your brain in the right mode, I'm going to suggest that you practice. You need to practice what you're going to do before you go to the frame. So here's my video. When you look at where I'm at my frame, okay? And I have a few things to practice here. I have on the right-hand side my gridded plastic. So with this, I'm going to take my dry erase marker and draw and practice on it. On the left-hand side, I have a large white piece of paper that I'm going to practice on. And I'm going to show you by drawing first how I practice my designs and then go to my quilt itself. Because I can't just go directly to my quilt. I can't just start quilting and think that I'm going to do a good job at it. So I'm going to move the machine out of the way. And here's my large white piece of paper. Now what I did to begin with was I folded the paper so that I had some simulated lines so that I could get the idea of where I was going to quilt, where I was going to put what it was that I'm going to work on. I also have my sketch pad here. So I have a couple different sketch pads. This is just a small sketch pad. It's not an extremely large one. It is spiral bound. That way I can fold the pages back. It is perforated, so if I liked something I could tear it out of here and use it. Now I'm going to take you back to, say, 4th or 5th grade. For me, I can't remember exactly what grade I learned how to cursive write, but I'm going to turn my quilting into cursive writing. I teach a class called From Cursive to Quilting, and that's pretty much what we're going to do today. So I'm just going to lay the paper here so that you can see it, and I want you to think about letters of the alphabet. The first thing that we all know that we know how to do is we know how to write our name. Well, that's a continuous line, and it's in our head. So we know that we can do that because we've done it every day for years. So I want you to look at the letters of my name. Well, the capital D is kind of fancy, but the lowercase e's, these lowercase e's are pretty easy. So I could do a row of lowercase e's. So that's using one side of my brain. Now I'm going to go to lowercase e's in the reverse, and that's using the other side of my brain. So I think I have my lowercase e's down, so that's when I might come up to my paper and practice my lowercase e's. And I'm going to go one up, one down, one up, one down. And I would do the same thing, drawing them out. Practicing my lowercase e's. Those lowercase e's could easily become a quilting pattern, as simple as you see them there. Now, I also think of a lowercase e as what I call a connector, okay? So if I do a lowercase e, go the other way, and then I could make a heart. So these help me to connect things together, lowercase e, and then a heart. So that's why I call those connectors. So practicing on paper first, before we go to the quilt frame, is really, really important. Then I'm going to practice with my machine without stitching. So I'm going to make sure that my handles are positioned where I need them to be for what I'm going to do. And now I'm going to practice my lowercase e's without stitching. Now I could record this without stitching and then have it to do over and over again. But it's really important to practice. Practice on paper, practice large, the size that I'm going to do, and it could be on golden threads paper, which is what I usually do it on. I put it on the white paper so that you could visually see it better. Okay, so lowercase e's, I want you to think of those as connectors. Now you've seen some of the paper patterns that I use, so I'm going to show you one of my paper patterns that I have that everything's connected with lowercase e's. So if you look at this, there are butterflies in this piece, and they're entirely connected with lowercase e's. And then the butterfly, and then a lowercase e, and then a butterfly. So when I say that the e's are connector, it's really important to know these aren't all the same size. They don't have to be the same size. I'm not trying to make a design that is exactly the same all the way across. I did a quilt the other day, and my friend was quilting with me, and I free motion quilted an area of it, and I'm going to bring it and show you in just a moment. And I free motion quilted one part, and she asked, how will you make it exactly the same on the other side? That's not important to me. Important to me is that the aesthetics is the same on the other side. So when I got done, I showed her. I said, look here, Barbara, the wings have the same feel, but they're not the same. And it's okay. It had the same feeling throughout the butterfly that I did. So keep in mind that these are not the same size. And you really want to practice, practice, practice. Now, if you wanted to practice this specific design and you didn't know how to do that, let me grab my golden threads paper and I'll show you how you'll do that. So I have my golden threads paper and I have one of my friction pens. And this is where I would begin to draw the design. So I'd lay this out. Now I do have some painter's tape here that I could hold everything in place with some painter's tape, or the embroidery perfection tape by Floriani. Either one of those will work. I'm going to find a starting point and I'm going to start right here and I'm going to draw. Now, why am I using a friction pen? Well, I'm using the friction pen for a couple reasons. One is, if I use a friction pen, I don't have to worry about this friction pen harming my fabric. And I would, of course, test it first to make sure that everything was okay. And then the paper and everything is easy to remove. If I use a marker and that gets on my fabric, it's not going to be a good day. And so it's really important to use something that's not going to harm your fabric. So I use my friction pen. So if I move this paper away from underneath, you're going to see that I drew the flower here, the connector ease. I didn't draw the butterflies. This particular pattern has two designs on it. So when I look at this, there is a red line and there is a black line. The red line is one design and the black line is a second design. And again, I would practice, practice, practice those designs, and then I would go to my machine and stitch them. I would hold this golden threads paper down and secure it to what I was going to quilt it on. And then what I would do next is I would stitch through the paper. Now, the great thing about golden threads paper is you can stitch through it. Now, I have a little bag of tools here. So this is my little bag of free motion tools. And in here I have my markers, but I also have a Steam-A-Fix. It's Steam Fix seam ripper. So inside of here is a seam ripper. Well, a little tip and a great find that I found was one day I was trying to erase the line off of here. And the paper ripped quite easily when I was erasing it. And I thought, ooh, that's really good. So I pulled this out, and once this is stitched down, I use this to pull the paper away from the quilt once it's stitched. So that's a Seam Fix seam ripper, and I use the eraser end. And there are two eraser ends on this seam ripper. There is a small end on this side and a larger end on the other side, and they both work very, very well when it comes to removing the paper. I really like that technique. I met a lady who won an award at the Pacific Quilt Show in Tacoma, Washington, and it was made with Alaskan motifs, and I asked her how she did it, and she said everything was created with golden threads paper, but the hardest thing was getting the golden threads paper out. So that quilt show is once a year, and I can't wait to see her and see if she's figured out that you can use this Seam Fix. Now, somebody's asking what a friction pen is, and these are pens I got them at my local quilt store because I want to keep my local quilt store in business. I shop there quite often. And they're pens, different colors. They come in a set. And these will steam away on your fabric. You do want to test it because on batiks and things it reacts differently than it does on a regular quilter's cotton. But I really like them because they're a fine line pen, and again they come in assorted colors. So I have them in black, purple, red, green, blue, all different colors. The other thing that I use to write on my quilts is, see if I have one in my little bag here. It's a silver pen, and the silver pen is wonderful. I don't see one in this bag, but the silver pen is wonderful because it washes away also, and that pen you sharpen with a pencil sharpener and continue to use it. It's called the Quilter's Choice. It comes in silver and it comes in white, and those pens are extremely nice also because they're made for quilters. So let's go to our next little drawing that we're going to do. So this was the connector E's. So the next letter we're going to do is the letter L. Lowercase, most of the time we're going to use lowercase because they connect. So that's an L. Well, what about if I take my L, an E, an L, an E, an L, an E, an L? Those look pretty good. Well, I can also do an L and an E, and an L, and an E, and an L, and an E, and an L, and an E. Now, it was interesting when I was looking for the things to talk about for today's webinar, and I looked at this and I said, you know what? That looks just like a leaf to me. So then I went to my patterns and I pulled this out, and here is that same leaf. It's an L with an E inside and then lowercase to connect it. So if I draw that as I see it on the paper here, it would be an L and an E, an L and an E, and then a swirl this way and a swirl this way. So those two, again, are also alphabets, fonts, cursive writing that we use every day. What's also nice on these martingale patterns is that they give you the steps of how to create each design at the bottom. And I really like that because it simplifies what we're doing and how to get from one point to the next. So we've done some E's and we've done some L's. Now I'm going to do another one that's one of my favorite, and people really like how this one works. And that is, we're going to do a giant zigzag. So here, get the camera to focus, I'm going to do giant zigzags. Now, I ended down and I started down. So over on the left, I started in the lower position and I ended in the lower position. Okay? Here, I'm going to do stars from my zigzag. So let me show you how you get those. You did the zigzag, you ended down. You're going to go left, right, left. Left, right, left. Again, I am not trying to make these perfect. I'm not trying to make these exactly the same. That's not the point of these. The point of these is to teach you how to get from point A to point B. Now, in between these stars and E's up here, let's do my L and E. Good. And below that, I'm going to do the random leaves, so the E and the L together. So you see that as you go across, you can change these. So it's L with an E in it, L with an E in it, L. They almost look like olives also, with a pimento. And practice. Okay, so there is our next row. So let's slide this up. The next letter I'm going to do, or technique I'm going to do, is the letter S. So we know a letter S, lowercase, and we know it pretty good. And we can draw it all the way across, and it comes out pretty neat. Well, what happens if we put a slight curve to that? Do you see the S? And what did that S become? That S is now waves. The other thing is that we can do an S, an E, an S, an E, and I do talk to myself as I do this so I don't get lost. So, are you seeing quilting patterns? Are you seeing what could become a design with a little practice? You know, it's not as hard when we do it on paper as it is when we go to the machine. So that's why I would like you to practice and get to where you can really see that you can draw it, you can stitch it. So some tips for free motion quilting as we're going along here. The first thing is you really want to relax. And we do this because it's fun. And if we're not relaxed, it's not fun anymore. And if you want to do original art, then you're going to draw it on the Golden Threads paper, or you're going to pounce it, or you're going to put it on your quilt in some way. Now, for me, I listen to music. I would have my radio on in the background, and you'll see that in a little bit. I'll turn my radio on. I'll do some free motion quilting, and you'll see that I'm going to really dance with my machine. And by dancing with my machine, it's going to be my dance partner. I'm going to dance with my machine. The other thing I want you to think about is how to get from point A to point B. So we talked about the E being our connector. And I'm drawing over on the left. I'll come into your view in just a second. So you see the E is the connector for this leaf. And I could do it where I do 2 leaves. And then a connector and a connector. And another leaf. So practice, and then you want to incorporate some tendrils. So if this was my piece and I said, you know, I really like this, but let's incorporate some swirls, I could come back out and say, well, I'm going to do a tendril here and a tendril here and maybe even one here. So don't be afraid to add things afterwards when you're drawing, because if you know you can do it as a continuous line, then you can keep doing it. And these can be double or single, meaning I could go 2 circle E's and then come up, and I'm going to come back in order to make it a continuous line. Or it could be a single. So if I was coming this way and then continue. So I'm going to pause here because we have a few questions coming in. And this is really doodling. This is really what I call drawing, what I call playing with, you know, what's in your head thinking about things you've looked at, thinking about the line types you want. So let me look at our questions and I'll be right back. Some really good questions. So the first question here is, how do I get my inspirations? Well, my inspirations come from different places. It could be that my inspiration came from carpeting, or just an image, or maybe fabric, and I pull something from the fabric. You know, inspiration can come from a lot of different places. And I brought another one of my little sketchbooks over. So I like birds, and so here's a bird, and all I did was start filling the bird with kind of the Zen doodle and making little components inside of the bird. And the bird has the tendrils, as you see here, and it has some feathers in this space. So really, the inspiration comes from all different things. Outside of my sewing room, I have a garden, flower bed, on the right hand side out that window, and then out the back I have bird feeders. So, you know, inspiration can come from everyday life. Angela would like to know, do I always transfer the designs to the quilt, or first do them freehand, or do I just ever go to the quilt and freehand practice? It depends. Now, the quilt I have on the frame today, it's a fun gift for a friend. It's really a gag gift, and not that I don't want it to be special, but that specific quilt, I would have no difficulty going right to the quilt and quilting it, because it really lends itself to be free form and freehand quilted. I still practice. So when I sit and watch TV, I practice, I draw. Some of the drawings that you see in this are things that I draw while I'm sitting at the TV with my husband. So in here, there are lots of different drawings and things that I've completed or started and then said, you know, I need to go a different direction. And there's nothing wrong with stopping in the middle of what you're doing and going a new direction. The big thing is that when you draw, you have to remember that free motion is a continuous line. So if I go over here to my grid and I have my dry erase marker, if I remember that I have to do this without lifting my pen from the template plastic, I know that this design could be quilted. What I also need to know is how big. So I'll either use painter's tape or I'll draw out the size of the design that I need so that I can fill that space with the design. If it's a block design, I would draw the block out with the grid, and then I would draw the design. So maybe this is just a swirl or a button flower, and it's a block. But keeping in mind that the pen has to stay on the paper, this is how I practice. And I practice a lot before I go to the quilt. I've gone to quilts and those quilts are still sitting or had been sitting and not completed until just recently, because I got frustrated with myself and I was hard on myself. The big thing is to remember, we're hard on ourselves, and I don't know why we do that to ourselves, but nobody's going to see those small things that we think we see in what we've done. And so keep in mind, as you do things, you know, don't beat yourself up. Don't be too hard on yourself. Now, a couple other tools, while the questions are coming in, a couple other tools that I want to make sure that I talk to you about are, there are 2 reference tool guides, and both of these I really like and I use them quite often. The all-in-one Quilter's Reference Tool Guide, this is great for new quilters and seasoned quilters. It helps you with yardage, it helps you with an understanding of quilt blocks themselves. Inside of here it walks you through some different things. It also talks about thread. It also gives you an idea of sashing and how much yardage you need for sashing. And there are apps with things like this now, but not all of us have smartphones. So that's a way to get some of those things that you might have as an app in a little reference tool guide. And then also this one is machine top quilting, but some of the things transfer over to the long arm. So I utilize this a lot, and it has a lot of great ideas. How to make your borders and how to make a free motion border fit, because that's not always the easiest. So in here she talks about how to fold your paper and make that free motion border fit. So there are lots of tools out there that can help you to proceed with your free motion and really have success with it. Now, I've showed you some of the letters. I've showed you how I sketch. And I do use this big paper. I get it on big rolls at my art store where I live. So let's move this out of our way. And underneath here is the quilt that I'm going to be free motion quilting. So my friend and I, there are 2 couples, my husband and then my girlfriend and her husband. We go to NASCAR every year, and we have a lot of fun. It's my one weekend that I do something just every weekend with friends and my husband. And so Michael likes this one driver, number 18, who I just don't like, who drives for M&M. So I'm making him an M&M quilt, and his wife said he's going to use it like a cape, like a superhero cape. So I thought this would be a fun one to pull out and kind of show you how I look at things, how my process works, and how I would begin to free motion quilt this. Well, the first thing was I needed to decide what thread I was going to use. And because I want the thread to show in the white squares, and there's white square placed all the way around the quilt in different positions, I wanted to use a thread that would show up in that space. Secondly, I wanted to use a thread that wouldn't really impede on the pattern of the quilt itself, meaning take away from the M&Ms. So I picked a red because when I laid the red in the brown, it did not take away from the brown part. It didn't take away from that M&M part, and that's what was important to me. Now I'm going to move my plastic grid, and I may pull this back out if I decide there's a part of the quilt that I want to make a design from and maybe record. So I would pull the grid back out. Then I would look at this to figure out, well, how am I going to quilt? So the first thing I said is I'm going to quilt in this first border. I'm going to do a border design all the way across this particular spot. And then in the blue, I'm going to do another border design. Now, if I needed to remind me where those borders, where my free motion quilting was going to stop, I would actually take painter's tape and I would tape it off so that I would remember where to stop. It kind of gives me a little wall to say, hey, stop right here, don't go any farther, because that's where your quilting is going to end. So I use painter's tape a lot just to give me that visual. And I use the blue, the green for this. It's not on the fabric very long. And then I decide what I'm going to quilt. So in this quilt, you don't see them, but there are little stars and there are little squiggles throughout the quilt. So I thought I'd do the connectors with the ease. And so I'm actually going to turn some music on, and I'm going to quilt, and you'll hear me talk to myself, and you'll see exactly how I free motion a quilt. So give me just a moment to get set up here. So my music is on. You may not hear it very well, but my music is on. I know that I have my machine in free motion. I've disengaged my robotics. I'm going to start by pulling my thread up to the top. I have already basted the quilt across the top with a basting stitch. I've loaded with my red snappers on my leader. I always use a leader, and most of the time I use my red snappers. And now I'm going to begin. So I'm going to do the ease, and then stars. Star and E. And yes, my lines are crossing over and I'm breathing and everything is okay. Lots of pretty patterns. The lines have to cross over, so don't be afraid of crossing over lines. And my E's are going both directions, and then every once in a while I put a star in. And the E's are not the same size, nor are the stars the same size. Now I'm reaching very far. Normally I would have this closer to me so I'm not reaching so far, but because of the camera I have to work around the camera. But normally you want to be very close. So what I'm saying is that I would undo this and I would bring the machine closer to me. So let's put the needle down. And roll the machine and everything closer to me. Once I do that, then it's going to be easier for me to reach it. So this is a little better than what I was reaching at that long distance. And the painter's tape is reminding me don't cross over. Because this is such a busy quilt, I'm apt to cross over that line and not even think about that I was supposed to stop. And I would quilt all the way off the edge of this fabric, securing that edge, and then stop. So the machine timed out because my hands were off of it, and I've completed that first row. Now I could have gone and recorded that so that I could use that same design at the bottom of the quilt. So the question is from Becky, can I show how I connect the star with the E? And it's going to be easier to show you on paper. So let me get my pad and I'll show you on my sketch pad, because the thread, it's hard to see the thread in what we're doing on the frame, but I can definitely show you here. So there are two things I want you to keep in mind. Anytime you can cross a line, it's better than not. So what I mean by that is, if I have an E and I'm doing a star, if I cross that line here, it's much better than if I don't. So if I don't cross the line and I do a star and I come like this, the likelihood is I'm going to have a space there. So I cross over that way or cross over this way, either way. I hope that helps, Becky, because the stars and the E's are a really fun one to practice, because it is something that's in your head and something that you can do easier than if I said, okay, we're going to do hearts, and you're going to go, how are we going to do the hearts? Well, the hearts are really close to the same way that the stars are. So let me come back over to the camera. So if I'm doing hearts, I'm doing the E's, heart, cross over, heart, cross over. Don't open that up. Cross them over whenever possible. Same thing when you're doing a flower. Let's talk about a flower. Here's the center of my flower. Do figure eights with your petals is better than doing petals all the way around. So I looked at the quilt and saw that I was going to do stars in that section. Then the next section I have, let's move our painter's tape, is the blue border that says NASCAR. And that blue border, I'm going to quilt with something else. So I'm going to put my painter's tape down, and I just continue to reuse that. I'm going to pull my bobbin thread up. So I do that by picking my foot up, sliding the machine away 4 or 5 inches, holding on to that thread that's on top, put my foot back down and do a needle up, and there's my bobbin and my top thread. So then I cut those. And now my bobbin thread is pulled to the top, and if I needed to bury it, I could. With this particular one, I'm not burying it. So here, because again this is kind of a whimsical fun quilt, I'm actually going to write in this border. I'm going to write words across this border. And again, that's a quilting technique without being a quilting pattern. Now I'm starting on the seam. So what that means is where the seam connects together, the outer border with the inner border, that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to slowly move the machine just to lock the stitch, and then I'm going to write. So I'm spelling out go fast, and then doing a few little connectors to go back. And then I'll just type go fast again. Remember, it's in my head too, so this is easy. And I do go back and cross the T and kind of do some swirls to get back. And I've got room for one more. And then back and cross the T. Now if I wanted some extra fillers in there, I could do that now, but I think that's pretty good. Lock my stitch, pull my thread up, pull the bobbin up, because I've locked it, and this isn't an award-winning quilt, this is just a quilt for a friend, I'll pull the bobbin thread up and cut it. And then I'll go to my next position. What I tend to do is I tend to do my top borders, the center of the quilt, and then I'll turn the quilt to do the side borders. Especially if I'm writing text, I want to be able to do the side borders and have a very simple design, but yet going the right way on the fabric. So I thought this was pretty fun. So we have these M&Ms and they have their little hands. So when I was going through my patterns, I was looking for, well, what types of patterns do I have and things like that. And I found this very fun pattern with hands and hearts. I have it upside down. Not that you would know that, but I do. So here's our pattern with hands and hearts. And why I want it right side up is I can see that there are three elements. There are hands, there's a single heart, and there's an echo heart. So with this, as I look at this, I think that this would be really nice to do as a border-to-border quilt. In the center section, quilt that piece with these hearts and hands and just have some fun with that. Do I ever stencil my quilt patterns is the next question, and I do quite often. I use Pounce and I use stencils, or I make stencils with my Golden Threads paper. I draw it out, then I pounce it out, then I stitch it out. So the process is still the same. If I'm going to free motion, unless it's stippling or something that I do all of the time, I really practice what I'm going to do with it. Now I'm going to show you the quilt that I did with my friend Barbara the other day and show you what I was talking about. My agenda today after the webinar is to quilt the quilt. So this is the quilt that I did. And a couple things about this is that it is a butterfly. It's symmetrical, but it doesn't mean that the designs on the left have to be exactly like the designs on the right. And the little body piece, I did this freehand. All of the green was done freehand. I did the wings with the robotics, but I filled in with freehand along the edges, and the same thing with the lower wings. I filled in with freehand. So what I'm saying is take the freedom to fill in with freehand also. It doesn't have to be all robotic. Your freehand can be added to the robotic. So in here I have robotics and I have freehand both. And even in the robotics section, I added freehand. So with this specific quilt, it lended itself very well to be freehand and robotics. The hard part was that these wing shapes, they're not really triangle, but I wanted to do them robotics, so I made a design to fit within this space all the way around, and then added the stippling in the green. There's a feather for the body. Let's see if I can flip it over and you can see the feather for the body. So here's the feather that the body is here, and then the rest was done with robotics and then filled in with freehand. But this is a pattern Barbara and I have been wanting to do for years, and we went on a retreat, and that's what we worked on, and we quilted them this week, and we're very excited. And again, free motion and robotic. So mix the two. Don't be afraid to mix the two. Now, I'm going to show you the quilt on the wall behind. I hung this quilt up specifically today because this specific quilt, it has paisleys in it and flowers in it. And so what I did was I echoed the paisleys. When I quilted that one, I actually took what I saw, the paisleys, and made those the quilting patterns and incorporated them throughout the quilt. So again, your inspiration can come from your fabric, it can come from your environment, from your surroundings. There are lots of different things to give you inspiration. Practice your cursive writing as quilting patterns. Look at your quilting patterns deeper than what you had before, because you're going to see when you look at them that they're really mostly elements of cursive writing. Here's another one I saw and I said, oh, so this one is pumpkins and alphabets. Well, I love the pumpkins. I'm not quite sure about the alphabet, but why not make it a cursive written A? We could do that. But the pumpkins are quite easy. It's a forward C, cursive written C, or a backwards cursive written C. So again, elements to help you get from point A to point B. I think it was Brenda asked about the stars. Well, after I learned how to do stars, Brenda, I purchased this pattern, which I thought was really fun. So here are the stars with fireworks. So these are just kind of little flame pieces that go out in a flower instead of curved pieces. Quite fun. Heather says she thinks what she has learned is to relax, have fun, and dance with her machine. And you know what? If you can do those things, it's really important. You know, with relaxing, and this is what I want to leave you with today, you need to not have a death grip on your machine. Try to move it with your fingers. Try not to grab your hand all the way around. You know, the big thing is with our machines is that they're there to help us be a good quilter, and sometimes we make it hard for ourselves. So don't grab a hold hard on the machine and practice. The first time I ever free motioned on my long arm, I had a 10-foot frame. I put 2 cheater quilts on it, 2 panels. One panel I did with a pantograph with the laser, and I free motion quilted it. The other one, I wrote a love letter to my grandkids, and I just wrote all over it, all over it, all over it. And when I was done, by the time I was at the bottom of the quilt, I really learned that free motion is not as bad as I thought it was. And I learned that I could relax and I could enjoy what I'm doing, because we do this because we enjoy it. So a couple of you are asking about this butterfly pattern. It's still around. It's probably maybe 10 years old. It is called A Quilt Without Corners by Cheryl Phillips, and it's made with a 9-degree or 10-degree wedge ruler, and I really like it. It is entirely round. I'm getting ready to put the bias binding on it today, but it is entirely round. Yes, and let's not be hard on ourselves. You know, some of you are saying we are hard on ourselves, and let's not do that. There's no reason to do that. Nobody knows that you drew that pattern on there. Nobody knows how you got that pattern on there. All they do is look at it and think it's beautiful, and then we show them our mistakes. So don't do that to yourselves. So as always, I want to bid you a happy quilting. It's spring. Spring is finally in the air, so we can get quilting, gardening, have lots of fun, and free motion quilt. It's not as hard as you thought it was.